Natalie Reed vanished without a trace, leaving behind a town desperate for answers. Daniel Monroe, her ex-boyfriend, had an alibi so perfect it seemed unbreakable, until construction crews unearthed her body buried deep in his backyard. What followed was a chilling unraveling of lies, secrets, and a truth darker than anyone imagined. Natalie Reed was the kind of person everyone noticed, not because she was loud, but because she was full of life. She worked as a veterinary assistant in the small town of Stonebridge, where everyone knew everyone else. At 25, she had a reputation for being dependable, kind, and always ready to help out a neighbor or friend in need. She loved animals, especially dogs, and spent her free time volunteering at a local shelter. Her world was small, but it was full: friends, family, work, and weekend hikes in the nearby hills. So when she disappeared on October 14, 2022, everything about it felt wrong from the beginning. It started like any other day. She clocked out of work at 6:42 p.m., smiled at a coworker on the way to her car, and texted her sister to say she was on her way home. That was the last anyone heard from her. She never made it to her apartment. Her phone went silent just 15 minutes later. Calls went straight to voicemail. At first, her sister assumed she'd gotten stuck in traffic or was visiting a friend, but by 9:00 p.m., panic had begun to set in. Natalie wasn't the type to disappear without saying something. She was responsible to a fault, never late, never impulsive. The next morning, her family filed a missing person report. Within hours, a search was underway. Friends combed the town in teams, posting flyers, talking to strangers, retracing her daily routine. Her car was found parked neatly 2 blocks from her apartment. The doors were locked. Her purse was inside. Nothing seemed disturbed. It looked like she had parked there on purpose and simply walked away. But walked where and why? Police searched local parks, hiking trails, and wooded areas. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters scanned the surrounding countryside. But no signs of Natalie turned up. There were no reports of suspicious activity, no witnesses, no struggle, and no cameras showing anything unusual. Her digital footprint ended the moment she left work. No social media posts, no banking activity, no GPS pings. Her life just stopped. Rumors quickly spread around Stonebridge. Some said she ran away, overwhelmed by something no one knew about. Others whispered about secret boyfriends or drug problems, none of which were true. Her family insisted she had no reason to leave. She loved her life, loved her family, and had even been planning a short trip with her friends the following week. Nothing pointed to a woman who wanted to vanish. For weeks, the investigation consumed the town. News trucks lined Main Street. Reporters knocked on doors, asking questions no one wanted to answer. But eventually the coverage slowed, the search parties disbanded, and Stonebridge began to move on. People took down missing posters, went back to their routines, and tried not to think too hard about what had happened. It was easier to believe she'd left by choice than to accept the darker alternative, that something terrible had happened, someone they knew might be responsible. But Natalie's family never gave up. Her sister posted weekly updates online, begging for any information, no matter how small. Her mother kept a porch light on every night, saying it was in case Natalie came home. They refused to let her become a forgotten name on a cold case file. To them, Natalie wasn't a mystery. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and someone had taken her. From the outside, it looked like a disappearance. Clean, quiet, no drama, no chaos. But underneath the surface, something had gone terribly wrong that night. And though it would take years to uncover the truth, Natalie's story was never really buried. It was just waiting, hidden in the most unexpected place. Daniel Monroe wasn't the type of person anyone would suspect of something dark. He was mild-mannered, polite, and kept to himself just enough to seem quiet, but not strange. At 28, he worked in IT for a small tech company on the edge of town. He owned a modest car, lived with his parents at the time, and spent most of his free hours gaming online with a tight-knit group of friends. People who knew him used words like nice, respectful, and laid back. When Natalie went missing, his name came up early, not because anyone had doubts about him, but simply because he had been her ex-boyfriend. Daniel and Natalie had dated for almost 3 years. They met at a trivia night and started seeing each other regularly soon after. At first their relationship had seemed solid. They shared a love of animals, indie films, and Sunday morning pancakes. But by the third year, friends noticed a change. They weren't going out as much. Natalie seemed tired. Eventually she ended the relationship. From the outside, it looked clean. No fights, no messy drama. Natalie had told friends it just wasn't working anymore. Daniel, according to everyone who knew him, had taken it well. When investigators approached him after Natalie disappeared, he was calm and cooperative. He told them the last time he'd spoken to her had been a couple of weeks before she vanished. He had no reason to lie, at least that's how it seemed. Daniel provided a full rundown of his evening on October 4th. He had been at home with his parents, logged into an online game with friends from 6 p.m. until almost midnight. His parents confirmed he never left the house. His friends confirmed he was online. Logs from the game matched his timeline. His phone records placed him at home. He had even been seen on a security camera at a nearby gas station around 5:45 p.m., just before heading home for the night. It was a textbook alibi. Police had no reason to press him further. Everything checked out. The timing made it nearly impossible for him to have been involved. There was no evidence linking him to her disappearance, no suggestion of recent communication or conflict. With no motive, no opportunity, and no physical evidence, Daniel was dismissed as a person of interest within a week. In the weeks that followed, Daniel faded into the background. He didn't reach out to Natalie's family. He didn't participate in the search parties. Some thought that was cold, but most chalked it up to awkwardness or discomfort. After all, they were exes. It wasn't his place anymore. He moved on with his life. A few months after the investigation cooled down, he started dating someone new, a local librarian named Jess. He got promoted at work, saved enough to buy a small fixer-upper house on the edge of town, and slowly built what looked like a normal, stable future. There were no red flags, no rumors, and no signs that anyone doubted him. His life unfolded quietly, as though nothing had ever gone wrong. Looking back, his alibi wasn't just solid, it was perfect. Too perfect. It left no room for questions, no cracks to dig into. It gave everyone, police, friends, even Natalie's own family, a reason to look elsewhere. And that's exactly what happened. But time has a way of loosening the tightest knots. Technology that once provided cover can also turn on you. Daniel's carefully crafted evening would later be picked apart, minute by minute, and what seemed flawless would prove to be anything but. For now though, he remained invisible to suspicion. In a case with no suspects, Daniel was the man no one looked at twice, and that was his greatest weapon. As the days turned into weeks, Natalie Reed's disappearance began to fade from the headlines. The news vans packed up. Reporters left town. The search efforts slowed to a crawl. Despite the initial surge of urgency, there was only so long a community could stay on edge. Stonebridge, a town not used to tragedy, began to settle back into its routine. People still whispered about Natalie in the aisles of grocery stores, or during coffee breaks, but fewer volunteered for searches, and fewer tips came in. The missing posters, once on every lamppost and bulletin board, began to curl at the edges and fall away in the rain. The police investigation, though still open, hit a dead end. Detectives followed up every lead they received, but none led anywhere useful. There was no indication of foul play at Natalie's apartment. Her phone had gone silent too quickly for tracking. Her car yielded no forensic evidence. It was locked, clean and empty, just sitting on a quiet side street. No neighbors saw anything. No nearby businesses had working security footage from the right time. She had simply vanished between two text messages. By the third month, her case was reclassified as a cold case. A detective was still assigned, but the team had moved on to more immediate matters. Missing person files were not uncommon, and without any concrete evidence of a crime, there was little they could do. Her family was told to be patient. If something came up, they would be notified. Until then, it was just silence. But not for her family. They never accepted the idea that Natalie had just walked away. She had left behind everything: her phone, her car, her dog, and most importantly her family. Her sister Rachel became the unofficial spokesperson for the search, posting daily updates, organizing digital campaigns, and even hiring a private investigator when funds allowed. Her parents, though quieter, suffered openly. Her mother developed insomnia, constantly checking the porch light, and sleeping near the front door. Her father, a retired carpenter, spent long hours in his workshop, avoiding the quiet of the house. For them, Natalie was always just out of reach. Alive, waiting, needing to be found. Every creak of the floorboards, every ring of the phone, carried a flicker of hope that never lasted more than a few seconds. The worst part wasn't knowing she was gone. The worst part was not knowing anything at all. Meanwhile, Daniel Monroe had become a distant memory in the investigation. His alibi held up under scrutiny, and he had never reached out after his initial interview. That struck a few people as odd, but there were no facts to support suspicion. If he had something to hide, he was doing a good job keeping it buried. In Stonebridge, people started making peace with the unknown. Some believed Natalie had met a stranger and run away. Others whispered darker theories involving human trafficking or forced abductions. Some simply refused to talk about it at all. It was easier to look away, but not everyone could. A local podcast picked up the case months later, breathing new life into the mystery. True crime fans dug through online records and Reddit threads. They re-examined maps, timelines, and even suggested the idea that someone from her past, maybe someone close, had orchestrated everything. Still, with no body, no weapon, and no witness, it was all speculation. The quiet of a cold case can be deceptive. It feels like nothing is happening, but sometimes, beneath that silence, the truth is just waiting for the right moment to surface. For now, Natalie's name remained on a list of the missing, her face frozen in time, on digital flyers, while the person responsible for her disappearance continued on. It had been nearly a year and a half since Natalie Reed vanished when Daniel Monroe purchased a modest single-story house on the far edge of Stonebridge. It sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, backed by a dense patch of woods, and needed some work, a few repairs, a fresh coat of paint, and a new patio. To outsiders, it looked like a man simply settling into the next chapter of life. He had a new girlfriend, a better job, and a clean record. No one gave him a second look. In the spring of 2024, Daniel began work on his backyard. The lawn was overgrown, the fencing was falling apart, and the entire area looked untouched. He told neighbors he wanted to build a patio, and maybe a fire pit. He hired a small landscaping crew to do the digging and leveling. On the second day of the project, while clearing out an old compost pile near the tree line, one of the workers hit something hard buried beneath the soil. At first, they thought it was a tree root. Then came the tarp, thick, weathered, and wrapped tightly around something dense and oddly shaped. The crew called out to Daniel, who reportedly turned pale the moment he saw it. He told them to stop working, and said he'd call it in himself. Instead, he disappeared into the house. 10 minutes later, it was one of the crew members who called the police. When detectives arrived, they quickly secured the scene. The workers were dismissed. The hole was marked off. What they unearthed would stop Stonebridge in its track. Beneath layers of tarp and soil, they found a human body, badly decomposed, bound at the wrists, and wrapped in old blankets. It didn't take long to confirm what many feared. Dental records identified the remains as Natalie Reed. The discovery shocked the town. Natalie had been missing for over 18 months, and now she was found not in a remote forest, not across state lines, but in the backyard of her ex-boyfriend, the one man who'd been questioned and cleared almost immediately. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed betrayal. Social media exploded with disbelief. People who once defended Daniel now wondered how they'd missed the signs. Daniel was arrested at the scene without incident. He said almost nothing during his initial interview, offering only that he had no idea how Natalie ended up buried on his property. He claimed he'd only bought the house months earlier, and suggested the body must have been placed there before he moved in. But the location of the body, the disturbed soil, and the pattern of roots, told a different story. Forensic experts determined the grave was not that old, no more than a year, possibly less. Someone had placed her there well after the disappearance. That meant she hadn't been buried immediately. She had been hidden somewhere else first. Detectives returned to the beginning, re-examining Daniel's original alibi and the evidence that had cleared him. Everything that had once seemed airtight now demanded scrutiny. His digital footprint, his online activity, his movements that night. Each detail was now a potential thread to pull. Behind the quiet face and steady routine, was a man who had gone undetected for a long time. The backyard, once a blank canvas for new beginnings, soil, and the pattern of roots, told a different story. Forensic experts determined the grave was not that old, no more than a year, possibly less. Someone had placed her there well after the disappearance. That meant she hadn't been buried immediately. She had been hidden somewhere else first. Detectives returned to the beginning, re-examining Daniel's original alibi and the evidence that had cleared him. Everything that had once seemed airtight now demanded scrutiny. His digital footprint, his online activity, his movements that night. Each detail was now a potential thread to pull. Behind the quiet face and steady routine was a man who had gone undetected for a long time. The backyard, once a blank canvas for new beginnings, had become a crime scene. Beneath the soil lay the truth he had hidden, the secret he thought would stay buried forever. But the earth doesn't forget, and on that ordinary April morning, it gave Natalie Reed back to the world, finally, and without mercy. News of Natalie Reed's body being found in Daniel Monroe's backyard didn't just stun Stonebridge, it shattered the fragile illusion that had built up over the last year and a half. For so long Daniel had been viewed as the least likely person to be involved. His quiet demeanor, his perfect digital alibi, and the absence of any direct evidence, had left both investigators and the community convinced he wasn't a suspect. But the body in his yard rewrote everything. The very man everyone had looked away from was now at the center of the darkest story the town had ever known. As police reopened the investigation, they started by dismantling Daniel's original alibi. At first glance, it had appeared flawless. He had been logged into an online game with friends during the time of Natalie's disappearance. His parents said he was home all night. His phone data backed that up. But now, with the discovery of the body, detectives began to reanalyze each layer, this time with suspicion instead of trust. They went back to the game logs and noticed something they had missed the first time: a break. Between two long sessions, there was a nearly 50-minute window where Daniel's account was inactive. At the time, it had seemed insignificant, just a bathroom break or maybe dinner. But with new context, it stood out like a warning light. Investigators began to wonder, had Daniel used that window to leave the house? If so, where did he go, and what did he do? Phone data revealed a brief period when Daniel's phone had been offline. It was subtle, just a drop-in signal around the time of that gap, but enough to raise questions. Even more troubling was a piece of surveillance footage that had been overlooked during the original investigation. A traffic camera on a side street near Natalie's apartment captured a car matching Daniel's vehicle driving by around the time she was last heard from. The license plate wasn't visible, but the make, model and even a bumper sticker matched his car exactly. All of it was circumstantial, but it was starting to pile up. Each crack in the alibi made the story less about coincidence and more about deception. Detectives began to look into the technical side of the alibi. How easy would it be for someone to appear online without actually being there? The answer: surprisingly easy. A simple remote desktop setup or screen mirroring could allow another person to move a mouse, launch a game, or send a chat message from a different location. If Daniel had prepared ahead of time, he could have created the illusion of being home while driving across town to confront Natalie. The forensic team continued analyzing the site where Natalie's body had been found. Soil composition suggested the grave was dug months after she disappeared. That led investigators to a chilling theory. Natalie had been killed the night she vanished, but her body had been stored somewhere else, likely Daniel's old house, possibly in a freezer, before being moved and buried when he bought the new property. That timeline matched the condition of the remains and the lack of early decomposition. Even Daniel's parents, who had defended him from the beginning, began to question what they thought they knew. Police quietly interviewed them again, asking more pointed questions. Could they remember exactly what he did that night? Did they ever leave the house? Had they actually seen him during the full game session? Their answers, once firm, became uncertain. Memory, under pressure, can become a fragile thing. The alibi that once protected Daniel was unraveling piece by piece. It hadn't been truth. It had been performance, a carefully built illusion designed to buy time, create doubt, and shift suspicion elsewhere. For a while it worked, but illusions only last as long as no one looks too close, and now everyone was staring straight through it. With the illusion of Daniel Monroe's innocence unraveling, investigators turned their attention to what had gone unnoticed the first time around. They began a slow, methodical re-examination of the timeline from the night Natalie vanished. What they found was both chilling and deeply calculated. The once seamless sequence of events began to show signs of manipulation, holes hidden behind a curtain of technology, routine and trust. The nearly 50-minute gap in Daniel's online gaming session became the focal point. It was just enough time for him to have left his house, driven to Natalie's apartment, and returned. Investigators retraced that possible route, and found it could be completed in under 40 minutes, leaving a narrow but critical window. When Daniel's car was spotted by a traffic camera close to Natalie's apartment during that exact time frame, the coincidence became impossible to ignore. That car, same make, same model, same worn rear bumper, looked more like a match with each passing frame. Although the plate wasn't visible, the odds that it was anyone else's vehicle were vanishingly small. Digging further into Daniel's digital trail, authorities found that his online presence that night could easily have been faked. For someone with IT knowledge like Daniel, setting up remote desktop software, or even automating simple mouse movements was hardly advanced. His activity logs showed just enough interaction to give the appearance of engagement, joining a match, typing short messages, logging off and back on at believable intervals. But now, those actions looked suspiciously minimal, like someone doing the bare minimum to keep up a front. Investigators also began to question the original assumptions made about Daniel's parents' statements. They had told police he was home all evening, but under further scrutiny, those memories turned hazy. His mother admitted she hadn't actually seen him for long stretches of time that night. His father had fallen asleep early. Neither could say with certainty that Daniel had been in the house during the critical window. Back then, it hadn't mattered. There was no body, no evidence of a crime. Now, with Natalie's remains in his backyard, those uncertainties carried far more weight. The biggest shift came when detectives started to look into where Natalie's body might have been kept before it was buried. The state of decomposition didn't match a body left exposed for 18 months. In fact, the condition of her remains suggested cold storage. This theory led them to search Daniel's new property more thoroughly, particularly his basement. There, tucked behind a set of storage bins, they found an old chest freezer. It was unplugged, thoroughly cleaned, and reeking faintly of bleach. Though nothing remained inside, forensic specialists used luminol to test for the presence of bodily fluids. The glowing reaction on the inner lining of the freezer suggested blood or other biological material had been there, even if DNA couldn't be recovered. It was a small but damning clue. Someone had stored something or someone inside that freezer, and they had gone to great lengths to erase the evidence. The implications were clear. Daniel had likely killed Natalie on the night she disappeared, stored her body in the freezer, and then later buried her in the backyard of the new house, once he had a place to hide her long term. The neatness of the plan spoke to forethought. The timing, the cleanup, the false digital alibi, it all pointed to someone who hadn't acted on impulse, but with cold, deliberate control. What had seemed like a clean break in a quiet relationship was beginning to look like a cover for something far more sinister. Natalie's disappearance was never a mystery. It had always been a crime, carefully disguised, and now, with each new piece of evidence, the mask Daniel had worn for so long was falling away. The discovery of the freezer in Daniel Monroe's basement pushed the investigation into darker territory. Until that point, there had been theories, suspicions, and circumstantial connections, but this was something different. It was physical, unsettling, and hard to explain away. The basement had the chill of a place meant to keep things hidden, and the freezer, though empty, told a silent story of something terrible that had once been stored there. Luminol testing confirmed what detectives had feared. The inside of the freezer showed strong signs of biological fluids, most likely blood. While no intact DNA was recoverable due to the thorough cleaning and the time that had passed, the pattern of residue was consistent with something heavy being placed there and left for a prolonged period. Investigators believed it was Natalie. The theory now was that after killing her, Daniel had stored her body in that freezer for months, maybe even close to a year, until he had the opportunity and privacy to bury her in his new backyard. The idea was horrifying, but it made sense. The condition of her remains had already suggested cold storage.
There had been limited decomposition compared to what would be expected if she'd been buried immediately. This clue, once merely a forensic curiosity, now had a clear explanation. Daniel had taken steps to preserve her body, not to save her but to delay discovery. It was chilling not just because of what he had done but because of the calm, measured way he had gone about it. Further examination of the basement turned up additional oddity. Cleaning supplies were stored nearby, bleach, gloves, disposable cloths, all in excessive amounts. Investigators found receipts showing Daniel had purchased these items not long after Natalie's disappearance. At the time, the transactions had meant nothing. Now, in context, they fit into a larger, more disturbing picture. He had planned for cleanup, he had planned for storage, he had planned for silence. A digital forensics team reviewed Daniel's search history and uncovered even more troubling signs. Several months before Natalie vanished, Daniel had researched terms like how long does it take for a body to decompose, how to preserve a body in a freezer, and digital alibi tools. These searches had been hidden under private browsing, but fragments were still recoverable. Taken alone, they might not prove intent, but in combination with everything else, they were impossible to ignore. At the same time, investigators began to build a psychological profile. Daniel had always seemed quiet and controlled, never raising his voice, never losing his temper, but former coworkers described him as detached, hard to read, and sometimes unsettlingly emotionless. An old neighbor recalled seeing Natalie visit his place even after they broke up, but said something felt off about their interaction. She'd once heard what sounded like arguing late at night, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. All these fragments, cold facts, casual memories, digital footprints, came together to form a clearer image. Daniel Monroe hadn't simply lost control one night. He had made decisions. From the murder, to the concealment, to the burial, he had acted with precision and patience. He'd counted on his quiet reputation, his technical skills, and the natural assumptions people make about someone who doesn't seem the type, and for a long time, he had been right. The illusion had held. He had lived in the same town, gone to work, started a new relationship, all while keeping a body in his basement. It wasn't just a crime, it was a performance, and the scariest part wasn't how he hid it, it was how easy it had been for him to pretend nothing ever happened. As investigators pieced together the evidence, a discovery from Natalie's past brought new clarity and heartbreak to the case. Tucked away in a storage bin at her parents' house was a journal. Her sister Rachel had packed up Natalie's belongings shortly after she went missing. Unable to bear the constant reminders of her absence, the journal had been stored along with books, photo albums, and other small pieces of Natalie's life. No one had paid it much attention until now. The notebook wasn't fancy, just a simple spiral-bound journal with a floral cover, but inside, Natalie had written dozens of entries over the span of a year, many of them reflecting on her relationship with Dan. At first, they were light, notes about weekend plans, jokes he had made, moments they had shared, but as the pages turned, a darker narrative emerged, one that hinted at a gradual shift in their relationship, from warm to cold, then from strained to frightening. Several entries stood out. In one, Natalie described feeling like she was being watched, noting that she had seen Daniel's car parked outside her workplace 2 days in a row. Another entry mentioned receiving flowers at her apartment with no car. While they could have come from anyone, she wrote that she had a feeling they were from Daniel, even though they had already broken up. The tone of her writing changed. What began as casual observations turned into anxious thoughts, uncertainty, unease, and a growing sense that she wasn't truly free of him. The most haunting entries were written just weeks before her disappearance. She recounted a confrontation between them that hadn't been shared with anyone. According to her journal, Daniel had shown up at her apartment uninvited. They argued about what she didn't say, but she mentioned feeling scared of the way he looked and wrote that it was the first time she genuinely wondered what he might be capable of. For the investigators, this was the missing piece. The journal gave Natalie back her voice. It painted a picture not of a peaceful breakup, but of one marked by control, lingering obsession, and fear. It also helped to establish motive. Daniel hadn't just lost a girlfriend, he had lost control. And when she refused to come back, when she moved on, something inside him had snapped. The journal also provided a clearer emotional backdrop to the crime. Natalie hadn't vanished suddenly out of nowhere. She had seen the warning signs. She had felt them closing in. But like so many people in her position, she hadn't known what to do. She had told no one. She had kept it to herself, writing it down instead of speaking it aloud. Whether out of fear, shame, or hope that it would pass, she had chosen silence, and in the end, that silence had left her vulnerable. The impact of the journal went beyond the investigation. For Natalie's family, it was like reading her final words. It confirmed what they had feared but never wanted to believe, that she hadn't simply been taken, she had been hunted. Every doubt, every strange moment, every instinct they had ignored suddenly made horrible sense.
With the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, the body in the backyard, the broken alibi, the freezer in the basement, and Natalie's haunting journal, the case against Daniel Monroe became overwhelming. The evidence painted a grim portrait of a man who had carefully plotted and concealed a terrible crime, evading suspicion until the earth itself revealed the truth beneath his feet. Yet, even with mounting proof, the legal battle ahead promised to be complex and intense. Daniel's defense team moved quickly. They challenged the forensic timelines, questioned the reliability of digital evidence, and suggested contamination at the burial site could have misled investigators. They argued that the body might have been buried by someone else long before Daniel bought the property. Twisting the narrative to sow doubt, they sought to paint Daniel as a victim of circumstance, a man whose life was ruined by coincidence and overzealous police work. But the prosecution was prepared. They laid out a clear timeline based on the evidence: Daniel's suspicious absence during his supposed alibi, the pattern of his internet searches, the blood traces in the freezer, and the chilling entries from Natalie's journal. Each piece fit together, forming a cohesive story of stalking, control, murder, and deception. The jury would hear about the obsessive behavior, the failed relationship, the fear Natalie expressed, and how Daniel tried to rewrite the past with lies and silence. As the trial unfolded, new details emerged that surprised even those who had followed the case closely. Witnesses who had once defended Daniel began to come forward with different accounts, stories of strange late-night visits, sudden mood changes, and subtle threats Natalie had confided to close friends. Some neighbors recalled seeing Daniel digging in his backyard at odd hours, carrying heavy bags or acting nervously when anyone approached. These testimonies deepened the narrative of a man consumed by obsession and willing to go to extreme lengths to cover his actions. Throughout the proceedings, the courtroom was tense. The prosecution presented forensic experts who explained the decomposition patterns, the blood residue in the freezer, and the digital forensics that uncovered the manipulated online alibi. Psychologists testified about the signs of controlling behavior and how such patterns can escalate to violence. Natalie's journal was read aloud, her words giving voice to the victim whose silence had been shattered too late. In the end, the jury had little doubt. The carefully constructed facade of innocence was nothing more than a mask hiding a calculated killer. Daniel Monroe was found guilty of murder, unlawful disposal of a body, and obstruction of justice. The sentence was severe, reflecting the cruelty and premeditation behind the crime. But the verdict was more than just justice for Natalie Reed. It was a reminder of the dangers hidden behind quiet facades and seemingly perfect alibis. It was proof that even in the smallest towns, dark secrets can lurk beneath the surface. And it was a testament to the perseverance of those who refused to let silence and fear win. For Natalie's family, the verdict brought a painful sense of closure. They still grieved the loss of a daughter and sister, but now they had answers, they had the truth. And while nothing could undo what had happened, they found some comfort in knowing that the man who tried to erase Natalie's life would be held accountable. Stonebridge slowly began to heal, the headlines faded, the search parties stopped gathering, but the memory of Natalie Reed and the chilling story of her disappearance and discovery would remain a part of the town's history forever. And the lesson was clear: sometimes the most airtight alibis can hide the darkest secret. In the months following Daniel Monroe's conviction, Stonebridge was a town forever changed. The quiet streets that once seemed so peaceful now carried the weight of a dark past, and neighbors who had smiled and waved now exchanged wary glances. The story of Natalie Reed's disappearance and the horrific truth buried in Daniel's backyard had shaken the community to its core. But amid the shock and grief, new questions began to surface. Questions about how such a carefully hidden crime could have gone unnoticed for so long. Local law enforcement faced intense scrutiny. How had Daniel managed to fool so many people? the police, friends, family, even his own parents. Was it a failure of investigation, or had Daniel simply been too clever? A public review of the case was launched, aiming to learn from the mistakes and ensure nothing like this could happen again. Detectives who had initially cleared Daniel were questioned, and protocols for missing persons investigations were overhauled. Stonebridge pledged to be more vigilant, more thorough, and more compassionate for those left waiting for answers. Meanwhile, the town came together to support Natalie's family. Fundraisers, memorial services, and community vigils honored her memory. A small park near the center of town was dedicated to her, a place for reflection, healing, and hope. For many, it was a reminder that even in the darkest times, the community's strength and compassion could shine through. Her story became a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about domestic abuse, stalking, and the silent dangers that can lurk behind closed doors. Psychologists and advocates used the case as a powerful example to educate others. They spoke openly about warning signs, the importance of listening to victims, and how obsession can escalate into violence. Natalie's journal, with its candid reflections on fear and control, became a tool for outreach, reminding people that the signs are often there. They just need to be seen and understood before it's too late. For Daniel Monroe, life behind bars was a harsh new reality. Stripped of his freedom and the facade he had so carefully maintained, he was left to confront the consequences of his actions. His trial, conviction, and sentence were widely covered by the media, turning him into a symbol of how appearances can deceive. Psychologists who studied him described a man capable of cold calculation masked by normalcy, a reminder that evil does not always announce itself loudly. Yet despite the finality of the verdict, some mysteries linger. Investigators remained puzzled about certain details, exactly when the body had been moved, the identity of anyone who might have helped or known, and the full extent of Daniel's planning. Small clues in the digital records hinted at possible accomplices, though no charges ever materialized. The case, while legally closed, left behind a trail of unanswered questions, a haunting reminder that even the most thorough investigations can leave shadows. In time, Stonebridge tried to move forward. The town learned to balance grief with resilience, sorrow with hope. Natalie's story became a part of the community's collective memory, a cautionary tale and a call to action. It reminded people to trust their instincts, speak out against fear, and never ignore the signs that something is wrong. For those who lived through it, his alibi was airtight. Until her body was found in his backyard was more than a headline. It was a story of loss, betrayal, and justice. It was a story of how a man who fooled everyone was finally unmasked. And most of all, it was Natalie Reed's story, a life taken too soon, but never forgotten.